Somewhere over the Pacific, a lone Hellcat pushed through cloud layers at speeds that made the airframe tremble. Behind him, 9 Japanese interceptors fanned out in pursuit formation, their pilots straining to close the distance. The American checked his mirrors, his fuel gauge, his altitude. He was alone, outnumbered, and running out of sky. Yet somehow, impossibly, the gap between hunter and hunted kept growing. The enemy flight leader would later report a single frustrated observation to his command. They simply could not keep up. If you find these stories of courage and strategy inspiring, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us keep these historical legacies alive. The Central Pacific in late 1944 was a theater of relentless expansion. American forces had leapfrogged across thousands of miles of ocean, seizing islands that Japanese strategic planners had once considered untouchable: the Philippine Sea, the Marianas, Pelu. Each conquest pushed the perimeter of American air power closer to the Japanese home islands, and with each advance, the nature of aerial combat shifted. By autumn, the skies belonged increasingly to American carrier aviation. The Fast Carrier Task Force, operating under the command of Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, had become the most powerful mobile striking force in naval history. Its air groups flew missions that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. Deep penetration strikes, long-range reconnaissance, fighter sweeps over enemy-held territory, where Japanese aircraft still rose to challenge American dominance. The Grumman F6F Hellcat was the instrument of that dominance. It was not the fastest fighter in the Pacific. It was not the most maneuverable, but it was rugged, reliable, and forgiving. It climbed well, dove well, and absorbed punishment that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Most importantly, it was available in numbers that overwhelmed Japanese production. By 1944, Hellcat squadrons operated from nearly every fleet carrier in the Pacific. The pilots who flew them came from every corner of America. Some were career naval aviators with years of peacetime training. Others were reservists who had learned to fly in accelerated wartime programs, their skills forged in months rather than years. They varied in temperament and background, but they shared certain qualities: adaptability, situational awareness, the ability to make split-second decisions in environments where hesitation meant death. One such pilot served with a fighter squadron aboard a fleet carrier operating in the Western Pacific. His service record described him as competent, steady, unspectacular. He did not seek recognition. He did not boast of victories. Among the more colorful personalities in the ready room, he was something of an afterthought, a quiet man in a profession that often rewarded aggression and bravado. But the Pacific War had a way of revealing qualities that peacetime evaluations missed entirely. On a day in late 1944, this pilot would find himself alone above enemy-held territory, pursued by a force that outnumbered him 9-1. What followed would become one of the most remarkable single-aircraft escapes of the Pacific Air War. Not because of what he destroyed, but because of what he understood. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. Before the war, he had been unremarkable in ways that mattered to peacetime America. He came from modest circumstances in the American heartland, the kind of background that produced farmers, mechanics, school teachers. His family had weathered the Depression through careful management and low expectations. College had been a possibility briefly before economic reality intervened. Aviation found him the way it found so many young men of his generation, not through wealth or connection, but through the civilian pilot training program that the government had, established in the late 1930s. The program was designed to build a reserve of pilots for the military expansion that seemed increasingly inevitable. It offered flight instruction at little cost to participants, and it attracted young men who might never have otherwise touched an aircraft control stick. He took to flying with quiet competence. His instructors noted that he lacked the swagger common to natural aviators, but his fundamentals were sound. He processed information methodically. He stayed calm when other students panicked. He learned from mistakes without making them twice. These were not qualities that produced headlines, but they were qualities that kept pilots alive. After Pearl Harbor, the naval aviation expansion absorbed him along with thousands of others. The training pipeline had accelerated dramatically, condensing what had once been years of instruction into intense months of concentrated learning. Primary training, basic training, advanced training, carrier, qualification. Each phase filtered out candidates who could not adapt to the relentless pace. He survived the filtering not through exceptional performance, but through consistent adequacy. He was the pilot who never washed out, but never topped the rankings. His fitness reports described him as dependable, competent, suitable for assignment in a service that celebrated aces and medal recipients. These were the words that described the majority. His assignment to a fleet carrier in late 1944 placed him at the cutting edge of American naval power. The air group he joined had already seen action in major engagements. Its pilots included veterans of the Philippine Sea Battle, men who had participated in the destruction of Japanese naval aviation during what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Among such company, a replacement pilot with no combat record was invisible. He flew his early missions without distinction. Combat air patrols where nothing happened, escort duties, where the bombers reached their targets and returned without incident, a few strafing runs against ground installations that produced no measurable results. He accumulated flight hours and operational experience, but he remained what he had always been, a competent pilot in an ocean full of competent pilots. His squadron mates would later struggle to remember specific details about him from this period. He did not drink heavily or gamble recklessly. He did not pursue nurses or Red Cross workers with the enthusiasm common to young aviators far from home. He wrote letters, read books, attended briefings, and flew his assignments. In the compressed intimacy of carrier life, he somehow remained peripheral, but certain qualities revealed themselves to those who paid attention. He studied intelligence reports with unusual care. He asked questions about enemy aircraft performance that other pilots considered academic. He spent time with the air group's intelligence officers absorbing information about Japanese tactics, aircraft types, and operational patterns. This was not enthusiasm, it was preparation. The Hellcat he flew was a marvel of American industrial pragmatism. It weighed over 9,000 lb empty, substantially heavier than the Japanese fighters it faced. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine produced 2,000 horsepower, giving it a top speed of nearly 380 mph at optimal altitude. But raw numbers told only part of the story. What made the Hellcat effective was its relationship with its pilots. The cockpit was relatively spacious. The controls were responsive without being twitchy. The landing gear was robust enough to handle the brutal impacts of carrier landings. The aircraft forgave minor errors in ways that more demanding fighters did not. For a pilot without exceptional natural gifts, this forgiveness was invaluable. He understood his aircraft intimately. He knew its best climb speeds, its optimal dive angles, its fuel consumption curves at various throttle settings. He knew how it behaved at altitude and how it handled near the deck. This knowledge was not theoretical. It came from hours of practice, observation, and careful attention to the feedback the aircraft provided through its controls. More importantly, he understood what the Hellcat could not do. It could not turn with lighter Japanese fighters in a sustained horizontal engagement. It could not match the initial acceleration of certain enemy types. It could not operate indefinitely on the fuel loads it carried. These limitations were not failures of design. They were parameters to be managed. The quiet pilot who studied while others relaxed was learning the boundaries of his machine. He was preparing for something, though he could not have known what form it would take. By late 1944, American air superiority over the Pacific was substantial, but not absolute. Japanese air power had been devastated in the preceding months. Its experienced pilots killed faster than they could be. Replaced, its aircraft production unable to match American output. But pockets of capability remained, and the Empire's defenders had adapted to their circumstances. The Japanese had learned that engaging American formations in open combat produced catastrophic losses. The Hellcat's combination of firepower, protection, and performance advantage at higher altitudes made traditional fighter versus fighter engagements suicidal. Instead, Japanese commanders increasingly relied on interception tactics, concentration of forces, and selective engagement. This meant that American pilots operating alone or in small groups faced disproportionate danger. A Hellcat, flying with its squadron, could rely on mutual support, coordinated maneuvering, and the concentrated firepower of multiple aircraft. A Hellcat flying alone was vulnerable to the tactics that Japanese pilots had developed specifically to neutralize American advantages. The mission that changed everything began as routine: reconnaissance. American commanders needed current information about Japanese airfield status on islands that lay along the task force's projected route. Reconnaissance required aircraft flying alone over enemy territory, photographing targets, and returning with intelligence. It was dangerous work, but it was necessary work. He drew the assignment through the ordinary rotation of duty. His section leader had developed mechanical problems during pre-flight checks. His wingman had been scratched due to a minor illness. The mission was time-sensitive, and he was available. Such are the accidents that determine who faces impossible circumstances. The briefing described a relatively straightforward flight path. He would cross the enemy coastline at altitude, photograph the designated airfields, and return to the carrier. The weather was favorable. Enemy fighter activity in the area had been assessed as moderate. If intercepted, standard doctrine was to disengage and withdraw at best speed. He launched from the carrier deck in the mid-morning, his Hellcat heavy with fuel for the long mission. The weather was indeed favorable: clear skies above, scattered cloud layers that provided both concealment and obstruction. He climbed to his assigned altitude and settled into the cruise that would carry him to enemy territory. The Pacific stretched beneath him, endless blue broken only by distant cloud formations and the occasional glimpse of island chains. At altitude, the war felt abstract. The engine drone was constant, familiar. The horizon curved gently at the edge of vision. Only the knowledge of what lay ahead gave the moment its weight. He crossed the enemy coast without incident. The first photography runs proceeded normally. He captured images of dispersal areas, runway conditions, revetments. The intelligence would be valuable. The mission was proceeding according to plan. What happened next demonstrated why reconnaissance pilots earned hazardous duty pay. Japanese. Early warning systems had detected his approach. Ground controllers had vetoed interceptors to his position. The first indication of trouble came as distant specks resolving into aircraft shapes climbing from lower altitude to intercept. He counted them as they emerged from the haze below. 3, then 5, then 7, more appearing behind the first group. The final count reached 9 aircraft, a substantial interception force representing significant enemy investment in stopping a single reconnaissance Hellcat. Standard doctrine was clear: disengage immediately, run for the coast. Do not attempt to fight odds of 9 to 1. The arithmetic of aerial combat made such engagements inevitably fatal. He turned toward home and pushed the throttle forward. The Hellcat responded, its engine note climbing as power increased. But the enemy fighters were positioned to cut off his escape route. They had altitude advantage. They had numbers. They had knowledge of his position and heading. For any pilot, this was the nightmare scenario. Alone, outnumbered, far from support with hostile aircraft between him and safety. The next few minutes would determine whether he returned to his carrier or joined the thousands of American aviators who had already disappeared into the Pacific. In the moments after detecting the intercept force, most pilots would have relied on instinct and training. The standard responses were well established. Turn toward the nearest cloud cover, dive for the deck to deny the enemy altitude advantage, call for help on the radio, and hope that friendly forces were close enough to respond. He did none of these things immediately. Instead, he assessed the enemy formation was climbing from his 780 position, spreading into an intercept pattern designed to cut off his most direct route home. The lead elements were faster than the trailing aircraft, creating a formation that would compress as it closed on his position. 9 aircraft meant 9 different threats to track, 9 different angles of potential attack. But 9 aircraft also meant 9 different pilots with 9 different skill levels, 9 aircraft with varying performance characteristics, 9 minds making independent decisions under pressure. The formation looked unified from a distance. He suspected it was anything but. His Hellcat had certain advantages that the interceptors could not easily overcome. At his current altitude, the R-2800 engine was operating near its optimal efficiency. American fuel was superior to Japanese aviation gasoline, providing slightly better performance than raw specifications suggested. And he knew his aircraft's dive characteristics intimately. More importantly, he understood something about Japanese interceptor doctrine that his opponents might not have considered: Their training emphasized aggressive pursuit and close-range engagement. They were conditioned to chase, to close, to kill. This aggression was their strength in many circumstances, but against a pilot who refused to fight, it could become a weakness. He made his decision. Rather than turning directly for home or diving for the deck, he maintained his altitude and adjusted his heading slightly, drawing the formation into pursuit while keeping options open. He would not fight them. He would make them chase him, and he would bet his life that his aircraft and his understanding of its capabilities would allow him to win a race he never should have entered. The first shots came from the leading interceptors, optimistic attempts from extreme range. Tracer rounds arced across the sky, falling short of his aircraft. The enemy pilots were eager, too eager. They were burning ammunition and energy, trying to force an engagement he had no intention of accepting. He pushed the nose down slightly, trading altitude for speed. The airspeed indicator climbed 360. The Hellcat was approaching its maximum sustainable cruise speed. Fuel consumption increasing dramatically, but forward velocity building. Behind him, the chase was fragmenting exactly as he had anticipated. The faster interceptors pulled ahead of their slower companions. The formation stretched, gaps appearing between aircraft as individual pilots pushed their engines to different degrees. What had been a coordinated intercept force was becoming a scattered pursuit. He noted the changes in his mirrors and made another adjustment, a slight turn, not toward home, but toward a cloud formation that lay along a parallel course. The turn would cost him speed, but it would also force his pursuers to adjust their geometry. Some would cut the corner, others would follow his track directly. The formation would stretch further. The next several minutes became an exercise in applied physics and tactical psychology. He did not try to outrun them directly, which would have exhausted his fuel and eventually allowed them to close. Instead, he managed the chase, using small altitude changes and heading, adjustments to keep the enemy formation fragmented while maintaining his overall course towards safety. The Hellcat's performance characteristics worked in his favor. At higher speeds, the aircraft's controls remained responsive, while many Japanese fighters became heavy and difficult to maneuver. In a dive, the Hellcat's weight became an asset, building velocity that lighter aircraft could not match without risking structural failure. He entered a shallow dive that pushed his airspeed past 400 mph. The controls stiffened but remained manageable. Behind him, the lead interceptors tried to follow. Some fell behind as their aircraft reached their own dive limits. Others pressed on but lost ground steadily. At the bottom of the dive, he pulled out smoothly and began a gradual climb that would cost him speed but gain him altitude for the next maneuver. The interceptors behind him faced a choice: follow his climb, losing the speed advantage they had built in the dive, or maintain their velocity and pass below him, losing their pursuit angle. Different pilots made different choices. The formation fragmented further. What had been 9 aircraft in coordinated pursuit became scattered groups of 2 and 3, spread across several thousand ft of altitude and several miles of horizontal distance. He repeated the pattern: dive, build speed, pull out, climb slightly, adjust heading. Each cycle stretched the pursuit further. Each cycle burned fuel for both hunters and hunted, but his fuel management calculations suggested he could sustain the race longer than they could sustain the chase. The enemy flight leader eventually recognized what was happening. His pursuit force was scattered, his aircraft burning fuel at combat power settings, and his target was still pulling away. The report he would file later captured the frustration of the situation in a single phrase that would be translated and preserved in American intelligence records. They simply could not maintain contact with the American aircraft at the speeds he sustained. The chase extended across dozens of miles of Pacific sky. Time compressed and expanded in ways that combat pilots found difficult to describe afterward. Minutes felt like hours. Hours passed in what seemed like moments. The world narrowed to the immediate concerns of airspeed, fuel state, enemy position, and course to safety. He maintained his pattern of dive and climb, speed building and trading, heading adjustments that kept the pursuit fragmented while inching him closer to friendly airspace. The cloud formations he had noted earlier proved valuable, offering momentary concealment that forced his pursuers to predict his exit point rather than maintain continuous visual contact. At one point, the lead pair of interceptors managed to close within what they judged to be firing range. He saw the muzzle flashes, saw the tracers reaching toward his aircraft, but the range was greater than they estimated, and he was in a shallow dive that the heavier rounds could not quite catch. Shots fell behind him, ineffective, but terrifying nonetheless. He did not panic. He analyzed. The shots told him that the lead pair had pushed their aircraft beyond sustainable performance. They would have to throttle back soon or risk engine damage. He maintained his dive angle for another few seconds, building additional separation, then pulled out and adjusted course again. The lead pair fell back, as he had anticipated. Their engines had been pushed too hard for too long. They were still in pursuit, but they were no longer closing. Behind them, the rest of the formation was strung out across miles of ocean, individual aircraft at varying altitudes and speeds, the coordinated interception having devolved into a ragged chase. His fuel state was becoming critical. The high power settings required to maintain escape speed consumed fuel at rates far exceeding normal cruise consumption. His mental calculations suggested he had perhaps 15 minutes of running time remaining before he would have to throttle back, regardless of the tactical situation. But 15 minutes at escape speed covered substantial distance, and the Japanese formation was burning fuel at similar rates, with some aircraft already turning back toward their bases as their gauges dropped toward minimum reserve levels. He crossed an invisible line in the sky, the point where the Carrier Task Force's combat air patrol coverage theoretically began. No friendly aircraft appeared to assist him. The patrol was positioned to defend against inbound threats, not to rescue reconnaissance pilots returning from beyond the coverage radius. He was still alone, but the Japanese pilots knew the same geography. They knew that continuing the pursuit would carry them into airspace where American fighters might appear at any moment. One by one, then in pairs, the interceptors broke off the chase. First, the trailing aircraft lowest on fuel, then the middle elements. Finally, the lead pair, accepting that they could not close the distance before their own fuel states forced disengagement. He watched them turn away through his mirrors, 9 aircraft that had set out to destroy him, giving up the chase and heading for home. The relief was physical, a release of tension he had not consciously registered holding. But the mission was not complete until he landed safely on his carrier deck. He still had miles to cover, fuel to conserve, and the constant uncertainties of naval aviation to navigate. He throttled back to maximum range cruise, accepting lower speed now that the immediate threat had passed. He calculated his remaining fuel against the distance to the task force. The margins were thin but manageable. The flight back was anticlimactic in the way that survival often is. The adrenaline faded, the routine reasserted itself. Navigation, fuel monitoring, radio procedures, approach patterns. The carrier appeared on the horizon, its deck crew, preparing for recovery operations. He entered the landing, Pattern caught the arresting wire on his first approach and rolled to a stop on the deck of a ship that had continued its operations without any particular awareness that one of its pilots had just escaped an impossible situation. His debrief was thorough, but not extraordinary. The intelligence officers were interested in his photographs and his observations about enemy airfield status. The tactical details of his escape were noted, but not emphasized. He had returned safely, which was expected. He had completed his reconnaissance mission, which was required. The fact that he had done so while evading 9 interceptors was recorded as a footnote. Only later, when analysts reviewed radio intercepts and captured documents, would the full picture emerge. The Japanese flight leader report had been transmitted to his headquarters. It described a frustrating encounter with an American fighter that maintained separation, despite the numerical advantage of the interception force. The phrase that would become associated with the engagement was not the pilot's own assessment, but the enemy's. The American aircraft was simply too fast. They could not stay with him. The escape became a minor legend within naval aviation intelligence circles, though the pilot himself remained largely unknown to the wider Navy. Intelligence analysts used the encounter to refine their understanding of Japanese interception capabilities and limitations. The report joined dozens of similar documents in the accumulated knowledge base that shaped American tactical doctrine, but the ripple effects extended beyond mere documentation. Fighter pilots who studied the debrief noted the systematic approach the pilot had employed. He had not relied on superior speed alone, which would not have been sufficient against 9 aircraft positioned to cut off his escape. He had fragmented the pursuit deliberately using terrain awareness and aircraft performance characteristics to stretch the enemy formation beyond coordinated effectiveness. This was not heroism in the traditional sense. It was applied engineering, tactical psychology, and situational awareness working together under extreme pressure. It demonstrated that survival against overwhelming odds was possible when a pilot understood his aircraft, his environment, and his opponents thoroughly enough to exploit small advantages systematically. The Hellcat's reputation as a survivable aircraft grew with each such report. Pilots who might have considered the F6F a compromise, slower than some alternatives, less agile than others, came to appreciate its balance of capabilities. The aircraft could take punishment, maintain high speeds in dives, and keep flying when other designs would have failed. These qualities made the difference between survival and loss in encounters where fighting was not an option. Training programs incorporated lessons from escapes like this one. Pilots learned that disengagement was not failure, that understanding enemy limitations was as important as knowing friendly capabilities, that combat arithmetic was more complex than simple counting of aircraft on each side. The quiet pilot who had survived by not fighting contributed to a body of knowledge that would help other pilots survive similar circumstances. The air war over the Pacific continued with increasing intensity as American forces pushed toward the Japanese home islands. The strategic bombing campaign required fighter escorts. The carrier operations required combat air patrols. The ground forces required close air support. All of these missions created opportunities for the kind of isolated encounter that could turn fatal instantly. Yet American losses, while substantial, remained manageable. The training programs produced competent pilots. The aircraft designs emphasized survivability. The tactical doctrine incorporated heart, one knowledge about when to fight and when to run. The aggregate effect was an air force that could sustain operations indefinitely, replacing losses faster than they accumulated, while improving performance through accumulated experience. The pilot himself continued flying until the war's end. His record showed no spectacular achievements, no ace status, no medals for gallantry in close combat. But it also showed no failures, no losses of aircraft to preventable causes, no incidents that brought discredit to his squadron or carrier. He was what he had always been, competent, reliable, professional. In a war decided by industrial output and accumulated small advantages, such pilots mattered more than ace statistics suggested. They flew the missions that needed flying. They brought back the intelligence that informed decisions. They survived when survival itself required skill and judgment. They formed the foundation on which more celebrated achievements rested. The Japanese officer who had led the failed interception survived the war. His post-war accounts collected by American historians studying Pacific air combat described the encounter with professional detachment. He had done everything correctly by the standards of his training. He had positioned his force well. He had achieved surprise. He had committed to the pursuit with appropriate aggression. But the American pilot had refused to accept the engagement his opponent offered. He had imposed different terms that favored his aircraft and his understanding of the tactical geometry. Against such an opponent, numerical advantage and aggressive doctrine were not enough. The officer's assessment, translated and preserved in academic collections, provided a perspective that American accounts often lacked. The enemy was not defeated through superior bravery or mystical warrior spirit. He was defeated through systematic exploitation of technical and tactical advantages, through patient accumulation of small margins that added to insurmountable leads. This was the reality of industrial age air combat. The quiet professional who understood his tools thoroughly was more dangerous than the aggressive hothead who relied on instinct and courage alone. Decades after the Pacific War ended, the patterns it established continued to shape military aviation. The emphasis on training, on realistic preparation for the uncertainties of combat, became foundational to American air-power doctrine. The idea that survival was as important as victory, that strategic success required preserving assets while achieving objectives, influenced aircraft design and tactical planning for generations. The F6F Hellcat retired from frontline service relatively quickly after the war. Jet aircraft promised capabilities that piston engines could not match. The veterans who had flown Hellcats in combat transitioned to different airframes, or left military service entirely. The aircraft themselves became museum exhibits, air show attractions, or scrap metal, depending on their condition and circumstances, but the lessons they taught remained relevant. The balance between performance and survivability that Grumman had achieved in the Hellcat influenced subsequent designs. The understanding that pilots needed forgiving aircraft that did not punish small errors with catastrophic consequences, shaped procurement decisions and design specifications. The pilot who escaped the 9 interceptors returned to civilian life with most of his contemporaries. He did not write memoirs or seek recognition. His story survived primarily through official records, intelligence analyses, and the fragmentary recollections of men who had served alongside him. He was not famous. He was merely representative of thousands who served competently in circumstances that demanded competence and punished its absence. In the ready rooms and briefing spaces where naval aviators prepare for missions, his story occasionally surfaces as an example, not an example, of heroism in the conventional sense, but an example of what thorough preparation and clear thinking can accomplish when circumstance overwhelms planning. The lesson is always the same. Know your aircraft, understand your limitations, recognize what your opponent expects, and refuse to provide it. The Pacific War killed hundreds of thousands. It destroyed empires and created new world orders. It demonstrated what industrial nations could accomplish through sustained mobilization and systematic application of violence. Among all that death and destruction, individual stories like this one can seem insignificant, yet they contain something essential. The war was fought by individuals who made choices under pressure, individuals whose training, judgment, and nerve determined outcomes that statistics could only record after the fact. The quiet pilot who refused to die when the arithmetic said he should have provides a window into what the war actually demanded from those who fought it. 9 aircraft had positioned themselves between him and safety. 9 pilots had committed to his destruction, and one man, understanding his situation clearly, had found the path through that his opponents did not expect and could not follow. The sky does not remember. The ocean keeps no monuments, but the truth of what happened remains, preserved in documents and memories, waiting for those who care to learn from it. Some victories require no kills at all. Some of the most important triumphs occur when a pilot does exactly what his training prepared him for, nothing more, nothing less, and returns to fly again because wisdom outran aggression in the moments that mattered post. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which historical figure we should cover next.